On this week's episode, Hey, wait a minute. Where are my keys?
I have them over here, Daddy boy.
Jack, you get your butt back here.
No, I gotta go mudding now.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Anxiety Monkeys podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and joining me here in the studio is my co-host, Michelle.
Good morning, everyone.
Okay, so today we're doing something a little special. I'm going to try and be on my best behavior today, and because nothing of note happened this week, we're going to be discussing ferrets. So I guess we're going to start with a history. The name ferret is derived from the Latin ferretus, meaning little thief. And some nomenclature here's in order. A male ferret is called a hob, a female is called a gill, a spayed female is a sprite, a neutered male is a gib, and a vasectomized male is known as a hoblet. Ferrets under 1 year old are known as kits, and a group of ferrets is known as a business. So I guess that makes Michelle and I a small business owner.
It is believed that ferrets were domesticated around 2,500 years ago. It's uncertain as to why ferrets were domesticated. The most common belief was for hunting or pest control. The ferret was domesticated from the European polecat and likely descends from a North African lineage of the species. In 1281, a ferreter was listed as part of the royal court. Laws were enacted that determined who could hunt with ferrets, as well as penalties, like off with their head, for those who used them illegally. Throughout medieval Europe, ferrets started showing up in artworks and in books. 1310, 1320, Queen Mary
Salter.
It has a picture of two women hunting rabbits with a ferret. And, of course, 1585, Ermine, which is a portrait by Nicholas Hillard. In 1877, farmers in New Zealand demanded that ferrets be introduced into the country to control the rabbit population, which was also introduced by humans.
Yeah, to try to control the rabbit population, they brought in 4,000 ferret polecat hybrids. And ferret polecat hybrids tend to be more aggressive than just regular ferrets. These were imported between 1879 and 1886. They were very effective and quickly eliminated the rabbits. The problem is that this left them with nothing else to eat, so they turned on the indigenous animal population. And with no predators to control them, indigenous birds were decimated. Unfortunately for New Zealand, the climate was hospitable to them, and there's now stable feral populations of hybrids that have threatened a lot of populations and even led to a few extinctions.
And I think this is where a lot of the states that don't allow ferrets get their fear from having ferrets.
Well, in all fairness, so California has a ban on ferrets, and the thinking on the ferret ban out there is that if ferrets got into the wild, they would reproduce unchecked and wreak havoc with the local ecosystem, which is actually founded kind of in ignorance because domesticated ferrets don't survive in the wild. This is why I have really horrible things to say about the kind of people who would abandon ferrets, and we'll touch on that again later. So here in the U.S., places where ferrets are illegal include New York City, I think Washington, D.C., the state of California, and the state of Hawaii. And out of all of those, the one that I actually kind of agree with is the state of Hawaii. Hawaii is one of the few places in the world, not just in the United States, the world, that does not have a problem with rabies. And part of the way that they keep this from becoming a problem is by maintaining strict control over the kinds of animals that they allow imported. And again, as we saw in New Zealand's case, introducing a predatory species, can have consequences in like a small ecosystem like that. So I can understand, even if I don't necessarily 100% agree with Hawaii's ban on ferrets. Anyway, getting back to the history, Ferrets were introduced into the New World in the 17th century, and from about 1860 to about World War II, they were primarily used to protect grain stores from rodents. In 1980, ferrets started to become more common as pets here in the United States. A government study by the California State Bird and Mammal Conservation Program estimated by 1996 that there were about 800,000 domestic ferrets being kept as pets here. So as we kind of touched on, the relationship between humans and ferrets has been pretty similar to the relationship between humans and other domesticated animals. So what do we use ferrets for? Again, as we've mentioned, they've been used for pest control, hunting rabbits. Some of the uses that I find particularly interesting have to do with electronics. In 1999, for instance, Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado sought to update some of their computers, and this involved upgrading some of the wiring and making new connections. These were small conduits, tight spaces, about 40 feet long, so they sent in ferrets to run the cables. But this isn't the first time that that's been done. During World War II, it's rumored that airplane companies like Boeing used ferrets to run cable in conduits inside aircraft, which kind of makes sense given the size of the aircraft in question. I mean, we're talking huge bombers, measuring hundreds of feet long, with control cabling needing to be run, from the cockpit, like all the way to the tail section, or from, one wingtip to the other. There isn't much in the way of actual documentation to support that, other than a couple of Boeing employees who say it happened. I don't know if it's one of those things where they just didn't document it in order to avoid giving a competitive advantage in the case of espionage, or if it was just something that was just kind of done that nobody really talked about. But one well-documented case that I really like is the story of Felicia the ferret. This was in Fermilab, here in our backyard here in Illinois. And basically, they needed to clean out some of the conduit there. And again, we're talking, small spaces that really didn't have tools for humans to use, and obviously people aren't going to fit to. So what they did was they took a ferret named Felicia, equipped her with a special diaper sort of setup, and sent her through the conduit to clean out the dust and debris so that they had a nice, super clean conduit to work with.
Hopefully, Ferret Repair paid her well for her services.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we get our Ferret Repair on the job, here's a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Pages Printed Plastics. You can visit us at pagesprintedplastics.com. That's P-A-I-G-E-S, printedplastics.com. We have a couple of different printers. We can do design as well as print. We can print anything from small figures like D&D miniatures to larger objects like computer parts, toys, props, pretty much anything you can imagine. So feel free to check us out. Again, that's pagesprintedplastics.com. And we're back. So for this next segment, we're going to go into what we think new ferret owners ought to know. First things first, ferrets aren't for everyone.
And please, if you're even thinking about getting a ferret, please do your research and know what you're getting into before you get one. Ferrets are not spur-of-the-moment pets or only temporary, and I'm going to release them to the wild and not care.
Yeah, these definitely aren't impulse pets. Properly taken care of, ferrets live generally between 7 to 10 years, and they need to be properly cared for during that time. So most ferrets in the U.S., most of the pet ferrets, come from a place called Marshall's Ferret Farm, and I'm not a fan of these guys at all. They mass produce ferrets. They provide ferrets for scientific research, but the thing that irritates me about them is that they tend to fix ferrets at as early an age as they possibly can get away with. This leads to the possibility of developing adrenal disorder later in life, and it's just not a good practice.
It also has other health risks related to it as well. If you fix ferrets too early, they tend to come out smaller compared to ferrets that are altered at a later age.
Yes, this is also true. The other thing they do that I don't much care for is they push their own substandard ferret products on a marketplace that's generally ill-informed. They claim that their ferret food is what's required to feed your ferret. And if your ferret develops health issues during their warranty period, the only way they'll honor that warranty is if you have proof that you fed them nothing but Marshall's ferret kibble. I don't care for these practices at all. As far as feeding goes, the best diet for ferrets is raw meat, bone, and organ. Ferrets are obligate carnivores, which means they don't process plant material. Candy's not good for them. Human food in general is not good for them. Things like raisins can be positively toxic to them. Now, having said that, we feed our ferrets a high-quality ferret kibble because we've tried switching them over to raw meat and they just won't do it. Ferrets tend to imprint on their food at a pretty young age, so even doing something like changing them from one brand of kibble to another can be a challenge in and of itself. The ferrets that we've got, when we acquired them, most of them were used to a Marshall's diet, and we worked pretty hard to get them switched over to Wisong, which is the food that we prefer.
That's right, Wisong Epigen 90DS, and that is the top tier food for ferrets in the ferret community. In fact, if Wisongs listen to this, we will gladly do an ad for you. The other thing is we also give them freeze-dry raw as well. Stella's and Chewy's makes a good one as well.
And we also use meat baby food, beech nut, I think turkey, chicken, things like that, because our ferrets are older. They're having some health issues of their own, which requires giving them medicine. And the easiest way to get that into them is to mix it into the baby food and sort of slip it under the radar.
And if you can't find beech nut, Gerber will do in a pinch as well. But it has to be the pure meat form. There can't be noodles or peas mixed in with it.
Yeah, in fact, you want to avoid anything with peas in it altogether because peas can lead to kidney stones, or is it bladder stones?
Bladder stones.
Yeah, bladder stones in ferrets, and that's not good. I've seen some photos of bladder stones that have been removed from ferrets, and it just looks painful.
Granted, right now there is no scientific evidence to this, but there's been enough cases to where you can sort of put two and two together.
Right. I'm generally not a fan of anecdotal evidence, but in this case, I think there's a tie. I just don't think anybody's done the research to establish that tie officially. But I feel pretty confident in the dietary decisions that we've made for our ferrets. Generally speaking, when we take them to the vets have approved of what we're feeding them, how we're feeding them. And while our ferrets do have health issues, it's not related to their diet. And speaking of vet care, ferrets are considered exotic pets, so vet care for ferrets is going to be more expensive than it is for dogs or cats. In addition to that, not all veterinarians are familiar with ferrets. So if you're going to get a ferret, you're also going to want to ask around, check with your local rescues and find a vet that's experienced with ferrets. Here in Illinois, one of the resources that we've leaned on pretty heavily is the Greater Chicago Ferret Association. They recommended Ness Exotic for us, and Ness Exotic has taken great care of our ferrets in the short time that we've known them.
And that's with Dr. Stottlemyre.
Yes, Dr. Stottlemyre really knows her stuff when it comes to ferrets. Again, find a vet who really knows what they're talking about when it comes to ferrets.
And then also we've had ferrets in Pennsylvania and also in Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, it was Healthy Pet Veterinary.
And Dr. Chrisman over there.
Dr. Carla Chrisman. And then over in Pennsylvania, it was Mannheim Pike Veterinary, and that was Dr. Prudente.
Yes, absolutely. Again, we've been fortunate to find veterinarians who really know their stuff when it comes to ferrets, and our ferrets have benefited because of it. So getting a ferret, there's a few routes. Like I said, most ferrets that you're going to encounter in pet stores come from Marshall's. There's another company called Path Valley, but they're more primarily towards the scientific research side of things. The way to tell that you're getting a Marshall ferret would be to look at their ears or between their toes, and what you'll find is two dotted tattoos. And what that means is that they've been fixed and descented. As far as descenting goes, this is another practice that I don't approve of. where they remove the ferret's scent glands. Ferrets are a member of the mustelid family, so they're related to like skunks, otters, weasels, badgers, wolverines, that sort of thing. And like skunks, they do have scent glands in their hindquarters. Michelle and I were at a ferret show when a couple of unaltered males decided they were going to get into a fight, and one or both of them poofed, which is to say he let his scent glands go. It's not pleasant, but it's not nearly as bad as being skunked. And frankly, you live. It's just part of the price of doing business. As far as it goes, all of our ferrets, they're Marshall ferrets, so they've all been fixed and descented. So yeah, Marshall's, getting ferrets through a pet store, you're going to get a Marshall's ferret typically. If at all possible, adopt, don't shop. Look in your area and see if there's a ferret rescue. There are plenty of gentle, good-natured ferrets looking for a forever home.
The other thing that's been out in the ferret community is that Marshall also overbreeds or inbreeds their populace as well.
Right, and they don't do a particularly good job of keeping records to ensure that overbreeding and inbreeding don't occur. Another option for getting ferrets is private breeders. Now, generally speaking, with a private breeder, you're going to pay more. You're going to be responsible for getting the ferret altered once they come of age. And generally, most breeders will offer you some sort of partial rebate in return for getting your ferret fixed. The thing to keep in mind, though, with private breeders is that the ferrets that they produce are going to be younger. You'll get them, once they've been weaned, but you're also going to have to put a little bit more work into it because a private breeder will work with the ferret to socialize them, but you're going to have to continue that process as well. And by socialize, I mean teaching them how to interact with humans, because ferrets have pretty thick skin and sharp teeth. So when they play with each other, they play a little rough. They tend to be nippy or even out and out bitey. And for humans, that's not a very pleasant experience. So you have to work with them to teach them how to interact with their humans so that they don't, hurt us. And this kind of leads to another point that I want to get into. Most people get pets for their children, but even as small as they are, they can be a little aggressive. And if you're going to have them around little kids, parental supervision is definitely required. Because again, your typical ferret weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 pounds. We're talking very small creatures here. And they're very delicate, so kids don't necessarily know how to play with them properly. And the ferret too, depending on their temperament, depending on how much socialization they've had, they may not be the most skilled at playing with their humans.
And also something else to keep in mind too, if you have other animals like cats or dogs, keep playtime supervised when you're putting ferrets with other animals.
This is for the protection of both the other animals and the ferrets. Because, large dogs have that prey drive, and ferrets tend to be small enough that in certain breeds they'll trigger that prey drive. But, a group of ferrets can easily gang up on a kitten and be more than the kitten can handle. So again, watch them, supervise them, keep an eye on them. And speaking of playtime with ferrets, ferrets need playtime. They need enrichment. You can't just put them in a cage and leave them there and expect them to thrive. They need a minimum of 2 hours of out-of-cage time per day. Ours tend to get about 4. In addition, we have a couple that we let free roam in our room at night. So, let them out, let them play. They like toys, and figuring out which toy is right for your ferret does require some experimentation. For instance, River likes rubber Kong toys, but Jack won't touch them. Jack, on the other hand, prefers empty water bottles as his plaything of choice.
And also rubber bones.
Yes, rubber bones. And with toys, you also have to be careful. Again, supervision is required because some toys can have pieces that break off or little chunks of rubber that they can bite off. And this can lead to intestinal blockages, which can kill a ferret if not caught in time. And if caught in time, they're still expensive to fix that damage. Speaking of ferrets and other animals, generally speaking, ferrets are group animals. They do well if they have a little buddy to play with. So if you get one ferret, plan on getting two so that they've got some companionship. Now, this isn't 100% set in stone. It's not ironclad. We've had at least one ferret who did not like the company of other ferrets at all. We'll get into that in a little bit. And I know we keep harping on the point, but there's a few things to keep in mind with ferrets. They have poor eyesight, a diminished sense of danger, and a determination to go pretty much wherever they want to go. So again, when you have them out and playing, you absolutely either want to make sure that your environment is ferret-proofed to a fairly well, or that you're giving them adequate supervision so they don't hurt themselves.
Something to keep in mind. Once a ferret learns how to climb a cage, the game changes.
Yeah, you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. They will continue to climb that cage. Or if they figure out how to get under a door, or they're smart, they're determined, they really do need supervision.
Or if they learn how to climb a chair and jump to a desk.
Yes, these are all things that we have seen based on our own experiences.
Also, something to keep in mind too, if you do get a ferret, make sure you have a first aid kit. Now, keep in mind, a ferret first aid kit is different than a human first aid kit. So don't go buy a first aid kit for a human thinking it's going to work for a ferret.
No, a ferret first aid kit needs to basically be custom built. And I'm going to plug a book here called Ferrets for Dummies version 2, which has a pretty good checklist of things that you want to include in a ferret first aid kit. We started with that as kind of a step one, and then we've added things to it over the years based on our own experiences. And one last thing I want to touch on with ferrets is another health issue that is seen in some ferrets. There's a type of coloration called blaze or panda. A blaze ferret is a darker colored ferret with a white stripe that runs down its head. A panda ferret is one with a dark body and a light colored head. And both of these colorations of ferret tend to be prone to a disorder called Waardenburg's disorder. It's a neurological disorder, so there is some brain damage involved, and it typically manifests in a flattened head, wider spaced eyes, and deafness. This doesn't seem to impact their quality of life. We have a ferret with Waardenburg's disorder, and he really does seem to be living his best life. But it is something to be aware of. You know, a deaf ferret is not going to come when you call them. If you're going to train them, it requires extra work.
And they will not respond to a squeaky toy or to you opening the cage door, and they are prone to dead sleep, so don't panic.
Yeah, let's talk about dead sleep. This is something that ferrets do where they sleep so deeply that when you go to check on them, it looks like they aren't exhibiting any signs of life at all. You know, we've owned ferrets for several years now, and we still encounter dead sleep. And honestly, it still sometimes scares the willies out of me.
Yeah, it's very terrifying when you first experience it. I remember the first time I experienced it with our Blaze, and I was really panicked.
Yeah, I think we both were. But then he woke up, looked at us like, what's the big deal? And proceeded to go play.
I wanted to add one more thing.
Sure.
If you're on Facebook and you're in need of a ferret group, there's one that's called Ferret Care and Education. It was made by our friend Lauren Kepler, and it is a very good ferret group that if you need assistance or need help or have any questions, if you join that group, they should be able to help you. Pretty much, if you're in panic mode, go to the vet.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen plenty of posts that drive me absolutely nuts where somebody will describe a problem that their ferret is having, looking for advice on the internet when really what they need to be doing is driving to the vet to get the ferret seen. And on that cheerful note, I believe we're going to take another break. We'll be back in a moment. This week's episode is brought to you by us. We enjoy bringing this podcast to you at no cost to you, but there are costs associated with running the podcast. We've purchased a new microphone for the studio, and we're in the process of purchasing new theme music to use for the episodes themselves. So if you want to help us out with that, there's a couple of ways you can do that. One is to tell all your friends. The more listeners we have, the more ad revenue we generate. But I'd like to get away from generating ad revenue, and the way you can help us out with that is by signing up and sponsoring us on Patreon. We can be found at patreon.com/anxietymonkies, and for as little as $1 a month, you can get bonus features such as being thanked live on air, or for $3 a month, you get ad-free episodes, and at $5 a month, we give you extra bonus Patreon content. So again, that's patreon.com/anxietymonkies. If you want to help us out, we'd greatly appreciate it. And now, back to the show. And welcome back. So in our last section, we talked about some of the downsides of owning a ferret. So you might be asking yourself, well, why would I want to own a ferret? First things first, the main reason to own a ferret is their personalities. As I mentioned, we're talking creatures that weigh anywhere between 2 to 4 pounds with a brain roughly the size of a walnut. And yet, as small as they are, they each have their own individual personalities. They're all very highly intelligent, despite that small brain.
And their little differences, just they make them so different from each ferret. And they're different from cats and dogs and birds and fishes as well. And that's just the thing. When you compare them to owning other animals, they're so different.
Yes, they're also uniquely well suited. For us, we tend to be apartment people. So, having ferrets is an option in places where dogs or cats might not be accepted. But, I mentioned personality, and one of the things that I've noticed with our ferrets, they generally have a tendency towards theft. In fact, it's in the name. As I mentioned earlier, their Latin name is ferretus, which means little thief. So ferrets like to steal small objects and stash them in hiding spots. And there's no rhyme or reason to what a ferret will stash. We've seen them take, the toys that we provide for them, obviously. But Jack likes to try to take my cell phone out of my pocket and hide it. We've seen them take hairbrushes, keys, wallets.
They also have a stuffed lamb chop that's like twice their size, and they literally pick it up and stash it.
Yes. So, a tendency towards theft, an obsession towards their toys. Another thing that ferrets do is they make a noise called duking. It's kind of a chirping noise that it's not terribly loud, but it's fun as hell to listen to.
If you go to YouTube and do a search for ferrets duking, it will come up.
Yeah, you'll find plenty of videos of it. In fact, I think we have a video of River duking back when we first got her. She used to be quite the chatterbox when she was younger, but she's gotten quieter as she's gotten older. On the flip side of that, when we first got Jakey, he was a very quiet individual. And now when we give him his medicine in the evening, after he eats, he'll climb into my shirt and just start chirping up a storm. The other thing that ferrets do that's extremely fun to watch and even partake in is they do this thing called war dancing. Now, the theory behind war dancing is that wild ferrets or polecats do this to confuse their prey, but they basically bounce around with no rhyme or reason. They really throw themselves into it. And again, this is another thing you can find on YouTube. I definitely highly recommend watching it. It's just fun.
For example, our Blaze Jack, when he really gets into play and he's wanting attention from us, he'll just come over and nip us and then just run away and start war dancing at us. And he makes these little chuffing noises that's his way of talking to us, we're guessing. And it's just his way of getting us to interact with him.
Yeah, we talked about Waardenburg's disorder in the previous segment. As I mentioned, Jack has Waardenburg's. And because of that, he's deaf. He doesn't vocalize the same way that a quote-unquote normal ferret would. So for him, it's a series of hard exhalations that sound like he's making chuffing noises. Again, it's a lot of fun. So Michelle and I, we got into ferrets after I graduated from college, but that wasn't actually my first experience with ferrets. Back when I was 17, 18 years old or so, a friend of mine asked me to help her move, And this had been my first time over at her place. So as we're going in, she says, I've got to show you something and you've got to promise not to tell anybody. And of course, this being Southern California, my first thought was, oh my God, she's running a meth lab. But no, she takes me in, shows me around her place, and there's this large cage, and inside were these two little creatures I had never seen before. And she introduces me to her ferrets. Now, again, ferrets are illegal in California, and the consequences, for being a human being caught with ferrets, it's a fine. I think there might be jail time involved, but the consequences for the ferrets are even worse. So she really didn't want me to let the cat out of the bag, as it were. So I kept my silence. I met her ferrets, and I didn't say much of anything about it to anybody. But we got into it after I graduated from college. We found a couple that were at a pet store. It was a joint venture between the pet store and the local humane society. They had been surrendered and were being adopted out, and that's how we ended up with Roland and Oi. And an obsession was born. Roland had a very gentle nature. He was very peaceful, very calm. Oi was the more playful of the two, and he really bonded with Michelle. He seemed to have a knack for figuring out whenever Michelle was upset, and he would snuggle with her extra hard whenever she was in a mood. So after that, Michelle ended up volunteering at the Greater Chicago Ferret Association.
No, after that was Susanna.
That's right. So Susanna came to us from a home that really wasn't suited for her. She was being fed poor quality cat food. Her owners really didn't know what they were doing, and they did not do a good job of taking care of her at all. I won't go into details, but let's just say once we had Susanna, we were driving back to Wisconsin, and I was in an absolute rage. But Susanna's story kind of ended on a mixed note. When we got her, it wasn't until we were actually on the way back to Wisconsin that we got a message from the previous owner saying, oh, and by the way, Susanna's a biter. Well, by this point, we'd already had Roland and Oi, and we thought we knew what we were doing. So we tried our level best with Susanna, but she had fear issues because of the way she had been treated with her previous owners. And because of this, her response to everything was to just bite
as hard as she could.
Yeah, she almost ended up taking the tip of Michelle's pinky off. And at that point, we realized, hey, we're out of our depth. We ended up surrendering her to another shelter who was run by a person who had experience dealing with biters. She rehabbed Susanna and sent her on to a home where, she thrived. She prospered. She ultimately had a happy ending. So yeah, after Susanna, Michelle ended up volunteering at the Greater Chicago Ferret Association, where she met a couple of ferrets that had been surrendered by their owner because they had to move and the new place wouldn't allow ferrets.
And at the shelter, their name was Cutler and Pepsi.
Yep. And Michelle got me down there because she's like, oh, you've got to meet this ferret. He's absolutely adorable and, so friendly and yada, yada, yada. We went down there and, yeah, Cutler, who would later become Jack.
Or if you're to call him by his full name, Captain Jack Harkness.
Yes, he definitely became a mama's boy. He's a prize-winning ferret, and he's such an incredibly gentle ferret. He gets along with everybody. People like him. He likes people. But his bonded companion, Pepsi, who we renamed River Song, basically became a daddy's girl. River, we discovered she's a fear biter. Whenever she gets startled, she bites. But she primarily bites me, and she primarily bites me at one specific spot on my wrist. And we think it's kind of evolved from being a fear thing into a play thing. And it's kind of funny because I do travel a little bit for work, and I've noticed a pattern that while I'm gone on travel, she doesn't bite. And when I return from wherever I've been, a couple of days will go by, she won't bite me. But by about that third or fourth day back home, everything's back to normal, and I am her favorite chew toy. Let me see. Then we ended up with Rosie.
Rosie is I call Rosie our little teacup ferret, but she's I believe the correct term is miniature ferret.
Or micro, yeah.
Or micro.
Yeah, she weighs about 1.5 pounds. I think she may have been the runt of her litter. She came to us through a friend of ours who was moving across the country, and once again, was in a situation where she wasn't allowed to keep her ferret, so we ended up taking her on. And of all the ferrets we've had, she is the most fearless. She's the one who learned how to climb the cage.
And also jump from the chair to the desk.
Yes, she's a little acrobat. Then we ended up with Eddie and Jake. Eddie and Jake's situation, again, speaks to the need for supervision when ferrets are interacting with children. It turns out Jakey does not respond well to squeaky toys. In a lot of ferrets, that response seems to be driven by the noise sounding a lot like a kit in distress. And so whenever he'd hear a squeaky toy, he'd come running and attack whatever was making the toy squeak. In this case, that included a small child. So their owners decided that Eddie and Jake weren't compatible, with that child, and that's how we ended up with them. Jakey currently has heart issues. He's a senior ferret. He's about 7 years old now. And last year, Eddie came down with a sudden case of insuloma. And again, this points to how fast things can go wrong with ferrets.
It was his first attack of insuloma, and there was nothing that they could do to save him.
Yeah, and again, this isn't the fault. We were out of town when it happened. We were on vacation, and we left him with a good friend of ours, and she did everything she could, but it was a very sudden attack, and he didn't respond very well to it, and the vets weren't able to help him.
And he also had Wardenburgers as well.
Yes, he was another Wardenburg ferret, deaf as a post, but he was a good guy, and I still miss him. So let me see, Eddie, Jakey.
Then that would lead to Peter.
Yeah, Peter's story is one that particularly infuriates me. He was abandoned by his humans in an apartment complex. I was actually out of town when we ended up with Peter, but I got a text message from Michelle while I was at work saying, hey, I just heard from somebody who has a ferret that I think would be a good addition to our business. And she proceeded to tell me about how Peter had been abandoned by his humans. When he was found, he was suffering from advanced adrenal disorder, which means that almost all of his fur had fallen out. So he was almost as bald as I was. So I knew we were going to get along famously just on the strength of that alone. I mean, we had the same hair color. So we brought him home, and we got him an implant for his adrenal disorder. He was being treated for that. His fur had grown back. He had become Michelle's little cuddle bug and Michelle's little slinky toy, because we had a staircase in our bedroom, and he would climb down the staircase. It took him a little while to learn how to do that. He would hang out at the bottom of the stairs, and all Michelle would have to do is go to the top of the stairs, look down at him, say his name, and he'd come bounding back up the stairs. But,
and he would not respond to Robert at all.
Oh, no. He absolutely would not listen to me at all. Not that we didn't get along. I loved that little dude. We got along famously. It's just he wouldn't come when I called him, but he would when Michelle called him. But Peter's life, I'm assuming he spent most of his time alone because he never did adapt to hanging out with the other ferrets. He preferred to be a solitary ferret, and we let him do that. And he lived out the rest of his life being loved by both of us. So, yeah, I guess in closing, do you want to add anything?
Ferrets have enriched our life in
ways that we didn't expect.
Yeah, and neither one of us expected this to be as big as it got when we got started in it.
No, not at all. And in closing, I guess what I want to say is that ferrets aren't for everybody, but the rewards far outweigh the costs. And if you're going to get into, having a ferret in your life, again, do your research, be prepared for the time and the money that needs to be invested in them, and be prepared for the love that you get in return.
And by all means, if you do get into a ferret based on this podcast, don't be afraid to reach out to us. We will gladly assist you if we can. We're very talkable people, and we love ferrets. And if we don't know the answer that you are looking for, we likely know somebody that does.
Yes, and we'll put you in touch with them. Well, folks, I think that's going to do it for us this week. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yes, you can find us on most of the major podcast markets, and if you'd review us and give us a 5-star rating, that will help others find us. We're on Twitter at Anxietymonkies, Facebook at facebook.com/anxietymonkeys, and you can email us at anxietymonkeys@gmail.com. You can also watch me get my butt whooped at Vintage Video Games on twitch.tv/anxietymonkeys. I broadcast Sundays at 10 a.m. Central. And finally, if you want to kick us a couple of bucks, you can do that at patreon.com/anxietymonkeys or go in for a one-time donation at paypal.me/anxietymonkeys. Until next week, she's Michelle, I'm Rob, and we're your Anxiety Monkeys.
Bye-bye.